July in central Pennsylvania is a special kind of hell. Cool nights tease you with the promise of a more pleasant day, but the sun rises and stagnates in the sky. The air becomes thick and heavy, sweat ripples from every pore, and the beautiful countryside becomes a diabolic dichotomy. How can something so pastoral feel so miserable? Even the rare breeze just displaces the warm air, never providing any much-needed relief. And despite the formidable sun and miles of tough marching they have endured over the last month, the men of the 37th North Carolina Infantry lined up in the woods, facing their fellow Americans across nearly a mile of open field. The shade must have felt like an oasis, a brief glimpse of paradise. But that paradise would quickly become a veritable hell on earth. These veteran fighters, already warmed up to the horrors of war from fighting on July 1st and skirmishing mostly on July 2nd, realized that these few moments in the blessed shade would likely be their last. The 37th North Carolina, now posted in a small woodlot just south of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, had been mustered mostly from western North Carolina, with the exception of the boys from Wake County, nearly dead center in the state near the capital of Raleigh. The men from Watauga, Ashe, and Buncombe counties knew of life in the idyllic, isolating Appalachians. 3 of these men mustered in the service hailed from Cove Creek, Watauga County: Nelson Adams, Squire Adams, Jr., and Wellington Adams. Cove Creek itself was a small smattering of farms and buildings nestled deep in those ancient hills, spitting distance from the Tennessee border. Like most places in those parts, farming dominated daily life. The fertile hills were perfect to raise livestock and grow tobacco. Despite Christmas trees now dominating the modern landscape, the former main cash crop for the people in those parts for hundreds of years was that addictive broad leaf. There were few slaves in northwestern North Carolina. In fact, Watauga County was reported in 1860 as not having a single plantation. The rugged mountain ranges and gruesome winters made large-scale plantations a near impossible feat. No, the people here were poor, rural mountain farmers. In fact, this part of the state, along with their neighbors in eastern Tennessee, was notorious for voting against the idea of secession. Whether it was because of their lack of actual slaves or their Appalachian inaccessibility from the rest of the now divided United States, the idea of secession never really caught on like it did in more fervent hotspots of Confederate activity. As then, as such today, life just tended to take on a slower-paced, friendlier, live and let live mindset. Squire Adams Sr., the patriarch of the Watauga Adamses, was a local farmer whose property and farm was nestled in the natural beauty found deep in the hollows of Cove Creek. Valued at some $1,900 in 1860, approximately $70,000 in current day value. He fathered 14 children in those hills, and he had been busy for good reason. He needed labor for his farm. Such was the tradition for much of poor, rural America. More children directly translated into more free labor for the family homestead. Squire Adams Sr. had no idea that the war between the states would affect his life so tragically. 3 of his 14 children were conscripted in April of 1862. Squire Jr., Nelson, and Wellington were joined up with Company E, the Watauga Minutemen of the newly formed 37th North Carolina Infantry Regiment. The regiment was a member of Branch's, later Lane's Brigade, of all North Carolina regiments. This Tar Heel Brigade was a member of A.P. Hill's famed Light Division, and at Gettysburg they would fight under the 3rd Corps with Dorsey Pender's division. They saved the day at Antietam for the Confederacy, marching an astounding distance to the rolling farmland surrounding Sharpsburg, Maryland from Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Tragedy struck a day before the Confederate triumph at Fredericksburg. Squire Jr. passed from disease, According to the Confederate Report of Sick and Wounded form for the 37th from the month of December 1862, Squire Adams is listed as dead by pneumonia at Charity Hospital in Gordonsville, Virginia. He was only 29 years old. Tragedy would befall Squire Sr. again the following year. His son Nelson would appear on the honor roll for the 37th. His passing is written down in that detached, short, military way of communicating. Died February 28, 1863, of disease in camp. Squire Sr. had sacrificed 2 sons to a cause in which he had very little to gain. Disease was a constant for the Civil War soldier. The 37th North Carolina was reported as having the most casualties of a regiment from North Carolina for combat and disease combined. Despite the tragic loss of his 2 brothers, Wellington enjoyed military service. He would be a part of Jackson's masterful flank attack at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863. In early June of that same year, he would join his fellow Watauga Minutemen and embark on a march into the halls of history, ending on the gentle farm fields south of Gettysburg.
And so here he was, a poor mountain farmer in his 30s, hundreds of miles from home, huddled under the shade of these mighty Pennsylvania oaks. Early in the afternoon, he witnessed scores and scores of cannons roll into position. All guns were aimed at that ridge across the fields. Around 1 p.m., nearly 150 guns all across the Confederate line, from the site of July 1st victory at Oak Hill and the Lutheran Seminary, all the way down to the Peach Orchard, erupted. An intensity of artillery fire had never been seen like this on the North American continent. Cannons fired and let loose a deep, bellowing fire, like the flames of Hades bursting forth from the earth. It's rumored that the incredible Confederate cannonade could even be heard in Harrisburg and Washington, D.C. The Western Hemisphere had never seen such instruments of destruction concentrated in a single spot. As the cannonade poured around them, there's no doubt those brave North Carolinians and the rest of their fellow Confederates knew what lay ahead of them. They were to cross a huge length of farm field to assault the Federal positions along that ridge, Cemetery Ridge. It was a tall ask. Though relatively quiet now, there's no doubt there were scores of Yankee guns waiting for their approach, excited at the chance to blast away at some Rebs. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, nearly 12,000 men from a host of southern states made their fateful march toward Cemetery Ridge. The following attack, known as Pickett's Charge, is one of the most glorified, horrifying, tragic assaults of the American Civil War. Mere words cannot express the carnage that followed the courageous fight encompassing the 2 sides that July afternoon. Courage is a word that is often overused in the English language, and as a result, frequently loses its meaning. Courage, in this case, is realizing that death awaits you about a mile away in a field somewhere in south-central Pennsylvania, either as a result of grape shot, or exploding shell, or bullet, but still moving forward regardless. Despite certain demise, thousands of Confederate soldiers made their way across the rolling farm fields of Gettysburg toward the east. Robert E. Lee, the immortalized hero of the Southern soldier, had solid logic in his attack. He had hammered away at the Federal left flank less than 24 hours before, causing incredible casualties on both sides at places like Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheat Field, and the Peach Orchard. He had made headway upon the Union right flank, capturing the lower breastworks along Culp's Hill and coming within a few hundred yards of Union General George Meade's main supply line and route of retreat, the Baltimore Pike. Lee's army, in the months leading up to his Pennsylvania campaign, had secured victory after victory. Second Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. No greater army had been assembled in North America, nor had any army in American history overcome such incredible odds against them to secure such successes. There was no doubt that the Army of Northern Virginia was at its highest peak in terms of morale. Who could possibly stop such a force of hardened, determined Southerners? Wellington Adams marched with his fellow Watauga natives and with his fellow North Carolina comrades across that now hallowed ground. The 37th was posted center right of Lane's 5-regiment brigade. Lane's brigade itself was in the first line of Trimble's division, placed behind Pettigrew's division. Lane's Tar Heels had been placed behind the Pettigrew brigades of Marshall and Davis, and at about the center of where the two brigades ahead of them met. The first line advanced finely and in awe-inspiring order. Confederate soldiers from all over Dixie launched a bold and risky assault against the Union Second Corps facing them upon Cemetery Ridge. Over 12,000 rebels paced their way across the ripe fields, truly a spectacle for many a witness wearing both blue and gray. As the rebels made their slow way across the farmland and fields, they soon found themselves under a terrible artillery fire. Not only was Cushing and Cohen's batteries unleashing from the ridge itself, but the many cannons posted upon Cemetery Hill opened fire. As that first line of Gray and Butternut continued to progress, they were met with a lethal symphony of Union guns. Soon the guns, lined up between South Cemetery Ridge and the Round Tops, joined in with their fellow Federal players further up north on Meade's battle line. The 37th, now at the edge of the woods along Seminary Ridge, watched in horror as their fellow Confederates were torn to pieces. Appendages, limbs, bodies tossed in the air by well-placed shots. Shrapnel and explosive shells turning men into clouds of red. And solid cannonballs rolling and bouncing dangerously across the undulating fields, bowling down poor souls. Davis's brigade of Mississippians and fellow North Carolinians were becoming disorganized as they attempted to remain in line while navigating the burning Bliss farmstead. William and Adeline Bliss's 60-acre farm was nearly smack dab in the middle between the Confederate and Yankee lines. On July 2nd, there would be several skirmishing and sharpshooter battles at this location. Some incredibly intense fighting occurred here, with both sides exchanging control of the family's home and farm buildings several times. Finally, the 14th Connecticut burned the complex to the ground when they found themselves outnumbered and surrounded by their foe, destroying the family's property totally. William would later file for $3,500 in damages to his home and farm with the U.S. government. He would receive nothing. Trimble's division was given the order to move out, and the men dutifully, honorably followed. No doubt every man had seen the carnage that awaited him, the carnage that would continue to grow more and more horrible the closer they got to that ridgeline. As they moved forward, they saw Davis's brigade and the brigade of Marshall maneuver around the charred Bliss farm, They also noted Brockenbrow's small Virginia brigade begin to stall in some fields to their left. It appeared they were taking fire from some skirmishers and the 8th Ohio Infantry. Pettigrew's division, that first line of rebel soldiers in that quadrant of the field, now began to reach the Emmitsburg road where, facing incredible duress under heavy artillery fire from all directions, they stalled. The men sought cover in the sunken roadbed and used this time to regroup and fire off a few pot shots at the Union line. The 8th Ohio, in daring and bold fashion, lurched forward from the line and took a position running almost perpendicular to the Virginians and began pouring fire into Brockenbrow's flank. The Southerners were soon overwhelmed and went for the rear. Trimble, seeing the collapse of the assault's left flank, ordered Lane and Lawrence's brigade to that flank. Only 4 regiments of Lane's brigade, including the 37th North Carolina, would receive the order in the confusion. They headed toward that direction. Southern courage was in high demand that July afternoon, and quickly the men taking cover in the roadbed of the Emmitsburg Road found theirs and moved forward. As they moved forward, and Trimble's line became the next to reach the safety of the roadbed, the 1st Massachusetts and 126th New York started to move toward the position of the 8th Ohio to join them in hammering the Confederate left flank. Lane's brigade crossed the Emmitsburg Road. By this point, the closest Union batteries, or what was left of them, had switched to grape shot. These were smaller diameter projectiles cased in a canister. Their effect is equivalent to firing a shotgun on a much larger scale. These projectiles were deadly effective against infantry at close range, and some Union guns just further south down the line were pouring in double canister, increasing the brutal lethality. Men would turn to mist when fired directly upon at close range. While many Confederates were falling to canister and musket fire, Lane's brigade now found itself in the midst of an intense crossfire. Men from New York, Ohio, and Massachusetts were shooting volley after volley into the Tar Heels from 3 different directions. As their friends and countrymen were obliterated around them, it became abundantly clear that the assault was a failure. Slowly, they began to fall back across the ground on which they once proudly paraded. That ground, soaked in blood, littered with rifles and knapsacks and limbs, air hanging thick and heavy with putrid smoke, that ground across which they retreated appeared to be some forgotten level of hell. The dying and disfigured around them, shouting for water, or help, or their mother, gave a sharp treble to the sinister, booming bass of triumphant Northern batteries. This was the so-called high tide of the Confederacy. Thousands lay dead and dying on the fields. Entire generations of Southern small-town men were wiped from the face of the earth. Their families would wait weeks for the horrible news as the dead were identified. The once beautiful, rolling fields just south of Gettysburg, filled with ripening fruit and crops, were now scarred, dirty, and littered. Wellington Adams himself would be spared the awful fate of so many of his fellow Confederates. He fell back to the woods along Seminary Ridge, exhausted and in shock of the events which unfolded before his very eyes just moments before. Many boys he knew and grew up alongside were killed, wounded horribly, or captured. One man, Thomas Norwood of Company A, was captured near the zenith of the assault. His July 16, 1863 letter to his father tells an astounding story. He was wounded, then captured, and taken to, quote, the big college at that place. After laying in Pennsylvania College and recovering for 2 days, he became determined to make his escape. He found that area under light guard and was able to make west for South Mountain. There, a pro-Confederate farmer gave him a change of clothes. He was able to use this disguise to infiltrate Union lines as a day laborer. Norwood was then able to make his way south and rejoin the lines of his beloved North Carolina. There, he told his commander that he, through his escape and resulting journey, knew the exact location of the Union Army. This information was summarily passed up the chain of command. The next morning, Thomas Norwood found himself having breakfast with none other than Robert E. Lee himself, sharing all the valuable information he had gained. Wellington Adams would survive not just Pickett's charge and the Battle of Gettysburg, but would go on to survive the entire Civil War, surrendering with the rest of the Army of Northern Virginia in 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse. He would then return to those sacred mountains of western North Carolina, with the loss of his 2 brothers weighing heavily in his heart. Wellington would pass away in January of 1887. Wellington fought for the side that supported slavery, an abhorrent institution. However, he fought not to preserve the property rights and exploitation of others by the wealthy Southern class, but because he believed his state, his home, and his family was under attack. Despite the zoomed-out, hindsight-driven view of the modern day, Wellington and his brothers had noble motives. To defend your family, to defend your home. These remain admirable, universal notions. Despite having ancestors that fought for Indiana in the Western Theater, I always find myself drawn to my Southern ancestor at Gettysburg. Perhaps it's our proximity in age, or perhaps it's because I hold Gettysburg, the National Military Park, and those Viridian, North Carolina mountains in the same adoring portion of my heart. I find Wellington's story absolutely fascinating. The fact that he fought from 1862 to 1865 and saw all of the most incredible, well-known battles in the Eastern Theater firsthand is completely enthralling. He was at Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Spotsylvania Courthouse, the Wilderness, Petersburg, and ultimately Appomattox. He saw the rise and the defeat of the Army of Northern Virginia. He saw the seeds of our modern America be planted, and he survived it all. It is indescribable to me how excited I get researching and having a much more personal touch added to my study and enjoyment of the American Civil War.